Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan political analysis. I'm your host, Paul Rader. So, this is going to be a little bit different today. Definitely not as energetic. Our topic today is political violence, but especially how we can push back against the acceptance of political violence. And it's a little less straight up civics oriented, though, of course, that is still very important to today's topic. This past week saw the assassination of conservative Republican activist Charlie Kirk. A few months ago, it was liberal Democratic politician Melissa Hortman in Minnesota. And as a few other examples, Democratic Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro and Republican President Donald Trump evaded assassination attempts. Just a few examples. This political violence is something that we need to address now, or matters are going to get worse. And this country will eventually fall apart. It's easy to just assume that it's going to keep going because it's been going for just about 2.5 centuries now. But you can't just assume that. Unfortunately, political violence is not anything new. It's been around since the beginning of human civilization, and there is some inclination in human nature toward dissension and strife. But it doesn't have to spill over into bloodshed. And all too often, that's what happens. And even for those people who wouldn't ever dare to physically act out against people they disagree with, or even threaten to do so, there is still a disturbing level of acceptance or even justification given when the target of violence is someone we disagree with. But the good news is that we can all be part of the solution, just with some simple changes, and that we can all be better about how we engage with politics. We have to be. And this is going to take Democrats, Republicans, and independents to band together to fix this problem. It's going to take conservatives, liberals, and those in between to get us through this. So today we're going to go over reasons why people feel justified in using or supporting political violence and ways that we can all begin to turn back this tide of violence and its acceptance. And before we can talk about how to turn back the violence, we need to understand why people think it is okay to be politically violent, to get physical or even verbal against other people that they disagree with. So, 7 reasons why people feel justified in using or supporting political violence. First reason is the sense of moral superiority. And moral superiority in general can happen to any one of us. I've definitely felt it at times. Obviously, not to the point of supporting violence, but people don't just feel like their opinion is correct. They think that they are morally better than people because of their opinion. In a previous episode, I talked about compromise and whether we really want compromise. And one of the things I talked about that was a barrier to compromise is the presence of moralized attitudes, where people feel that they are standing on business, basically, that they have to stand on their moral principles, and that for them to budge is not only wrong, but that would be immoral of them to do so. So they have to stand firm. It's not even about winning, it's about adhering to rules that they have established for themselves. And having these moralized attitudes is going to make you more likely to support political violence. That might sound weird because, oh, well, if you think you're morally superior, how are you going to justify violence? A lot of people will tell themselves it's for the greater good, or that they're just preventing violence from the other side. It's amazing the mental gymnastics that people can do when it comes to politics. You're convinced that somebody else not adhering to your rules means that they are being immoral and that they are a threat to morality in general. So there has to be somebody that stands up against it, even if that means assaulting people or even killing them. And it's just this general strong desire to be right, to be correct. We convince ourselves it is morally correct and just to destroy the quote unquote other. So there is no talking to other people. We have to go until one side or the other loses. Second reason that people feel justified in using political violence is that they treat politics as an existential crisis. This is something that happens way too often, where basically every political battle is seen as a battle for the soul of America or for the soul of the community. When you think the existence of other views is a threat to your existence, you want to destroy that threat. It's just that basic instinct of there's something threatening me, there's something threatening that the people I care about. I have to make sure that they don't do that. I'm going to stand up against them. And there's an outsized influence of people who think that they are being existentially threatened. They have more incentive to participate more frequently in politics, so they have more impact on political decisions. And their policies reflect the fact that they think that there's an existential crisis going on. Reason number three that people feel justified in using political violence is that people feel that they're not heard and that their rights are being taken away. When we don't think we're being heard, we lash out. And that's not just in politics, that's in other dynamics and situations. We're talking to a family member or a friend, a spouse, a significant other. We think they're not listening. We'll sometimes yell at them. You not necessarily get physical, but you might yell at them because you think that you're not being heard, that you're not being understood. And beyond politics, think of how many times people have used violence when they feel like their voice isn't heard. And to some extent, that anger is understandable. When you think that you're not being heard, don't expect people to not be angry about that. But it can't spill over to actual violence. And sometimes the perception of rights being taken away is not accurate, but sometimes people have these feelings of victimhood, this sense of being unfairly and unjustly treated, which leads people to greater support for violence. Now, sometimes that is the case. Sometimes people's rights are being taken away or they're being suppressed. And that's something that we do need to address. But we cannot address it by being violent, by being willing to kill each other over it. Fourth reason that people feel justified in using political violence, and this is arguably one of the biggest ones, if not the biggest one, it's a higher usage of social media. That is associated with more support for political violence. Studies have shown that, and it makes sense. Ironically, even though it's social media, there is more dissociation from each other by being on social media all the time. You're just those chronically, terminally online people that become more detached from personal relationships and start seeing others as not real people. People become those keyboard warriors and feel super powerful behind a computer screen because they don't have that human interaction. So they just think this person is just exactly what I see. And so this social media just really incentivizes that kind of behavior by social media algorithms and showing you what you are predisposed to agree with. People online all the time see this inciting and outrage content even more than the average person does. We all see it and we all are affected by it. But people who are just online 4, 5, 6 hours a day, especially on social media that whole time, it's a more pronounced problem for them. The content is already engineered to create more engagement, and what creates more engagement? Anger, frustration, bitterness, distrust, and all these things can incentivize people to be more supportive of political violence, if not actually use it themselves. And it's just these echo chambers that also allow just the voices calling for rage and violence to take over more of the sound space for people. So that's all they're hearing, and then that's all they seek out. Another reason why people feel justified in political violence is just there's this higher level of affective polarization, which, whether this is the most effectively polarized we've been, that's a debate that many people have had, and whether it is or it isn't the point. The point is there is a very heightened sense of affective polarization. Affective being our thoughts and feelings about each other. There's the partisan polarization, how far the parties are, the ideological polarization, how far the conservative and liberal camps are, issue polarization, and yes, those can lead to affective polarization. But if affective polarization tends to more feed into those, and you can have very stark views based on party or ideology or issues and still get along with other people. But a lot of times that's not what happens. But it's really the affective polarization that is what we need to watch out for. And affective meaning, or affective polarization leads to these feelings of hate, fear, anger, disgust, distrust towards this quote unquote other side, this whole in group, out group nonsense where there is that other group and they're terrible and everything about them is terrible. Our group is great. We don't do anything wrong. It's always the other person, the other group. And when you feel these things, you feel you're more likely to be supportive of violence against that other group because they are causing you these negative emotions, whether it's they actually are contributing to those negative emotions or it's just your bias. In any case, you see them as they're the ones who are causing me to feel anger and bitterness and disgust and all these negative emotions. We have to destroy them. Another reason that people feel that political violence is okay is a distrust of political institutions and deeming them illegitimate. And unfortunately, there are a lot of political actors that feed into that and say it's these institutions that are the problem. But conveniently, if I'm there, we're going to fix that. Now, you probably have somebody specifically in mind when you hear that. But the problem is, there are a lot of people that do that across the political spectrum. It's not just a one person thing or a one side thing. This is something that happens a lot across political views. We have a serious issue with distrust of political institutions. Yeah, we should want to see them get better. Yes, a lot of these institutions have major flaws. Of course they do. They're occupied by human beings, and human beings created them. So these institutions are not flawless by any means. But deeming them illegitimate, especially if it's only based on who occupies the office, is a dangerous notion. So if our opinion of the legitimacy of the Supreme Court is based on whether we agree with their conservative majority or we don't, that's dangerous. Even if you're considering them legitimate because it's a conservative majority, that's a problem, because what happens when it becomes a liberal majority? Does it suddenly lose its legitimacy? And then the people who thought it was, or who think it's illegitimate now, they're going to suddenly think it's legitimate if the Supreme Court flips. That's not how we should be treating things. It should not be to the point where we have no regard for these institutions unless it's conveniently occupied by people we agree with. That's not the way to go about things. And so if you don't trust these institutions at all because and it's based on who's in them, you are going to be more likely to support violence against those occupants and those institutions, their actual buildings. And especially when their officials that we don't support are in those buildings, we become supportive of violence against them. Bombings, shootings, whatever means to incite violence against those symbols, not just the people in them, but those symbols. That is a very serious problem we have. And it's fueling this distrust of political institutions where there's something endemically wrong to the point where we have to do something against that threat. That's not something that we that's not something that we can be doing. that we should be doing. We can't. There's criticism is perfectly fine. You should be able to criticize them, but it should not get to the point where you're actually willing to be violent against those institutions and those officials. And then the last reason I want to cover of why people feel justified in using political violence is the problem of disinformation and misinformation. So both are factually wrong, but misinformation is not intended to deceive. Disinformation is intended to deceive. You think disinformation, deceive, they both start with the same letter, D. But they both can lead to more acceptance of violence. So if I think one big thing is that people support, or they perceive that the quote unquote other side is more supportive of violence than they actually are. And that's something we're going to talk about a little bit more later. There are a lot fewer people that are accepting of violence than we think there are. It's just they have an outsized influence. Misinformation, you might really think that the other side, quote unquote, is more supportive of violence, but you're just mistaken. You're misinformed. So, mistaken, misinformed, deceive, disinformation. But that still may lead you to be more violent in retaliation. You might think that retaliation is justified because, well, they're going to be violent, so we're going to be violent in turn. And when it's disinformation, it's even worse. You might know that they're not actually more inclined to violence like you're saying they are, but you're purposely saying that so that you do incite violence. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of, now that side supports violence. Now my side is going to be more supportive of violence. And then it's just this vicious cycle that goes back and forth. Now that's the doom and gloom portion. Now we need to talk about ways that we can tamp down political violence and its acceptance, because we can do this. There are positive aspects to this. There are things that can be done. This does not have to be the way things are. So I'm going to talk about 8 ways that you can tamp down political violence. And really, so much of this issue starts with self-awareness for everybody. You're a hardcore liberal Democrat, hardcore conservative Republican, super moderate independent, and everything in between and outside of those. Everybody needs to be more self-aware, because all of us can be better. So we need to stop constantly blaming other people. Stop blaming this other side. Democrats and liberals need to stop blaming conservatives and Republicans. Conservatives and Republicans need to stop blaming liberals and Democrats. Moderates and independents need to stop just blaming both of the sides, or the one side that they tend to not support. Everybody can be better. I can be better. And I try to get better every day. Sometimes we feed the fuel, or the fire that's fueling polarization and the desire for violence unintentionally. We need to stop engaging with these kinds of things, especially on social media, that fuel these flames. Stop thinking that we know more about another group than we actually do. There's so many ways that we can start to be more self-aware about how we can solve this issue. Because even if we're not actually supporting political violence, we may do things that unintentionally exacerbate it. It's that whole thing I talk about in my educational email course about how ways that we unintentionally inflame polarization. And of course, polarization leads to more support for political violence. So if we are cognizant of how we can unintentionally exacerbate polarization, we can then not stop, but we can mitigate this acceptance of political violence. So much of this starts with self-awareness. Now, more specific ways that we can help tamp down political violence. One way, improved civics education. Greater civic knowledge has been shown to lead to less polarization, less likelihood to be manipulated by people, because people who are deliberately manipulating, whether it's politicians or social media grifters, they know that a lot of people are just going to listen to what they have to say because they tend to agree with them. So they can give them false or misleading information about how government works, and people will listen to them because they're not giving any critical thought to what these grifters are saying. But when you have civic education, when you improve it in schools, when you have better continuing education for adults so that they can learn civics, especially because if they had poor civics education when they were in school, even if you improve civics education in schools now, which obviously is great and we should be doing that, that doesn't help the adults who are already out of school. So we need to do what we can to improve civics education for them as well, which is obviously a lot easier said than done. But civics education is in a poor state. Even the most basic knowledge of government isn't well known, like even naming just one U.S. Supreme Court justice or knowing that there's 3 branches of government. There's a disturbingly low percentage of people who know those things. Even just those basics like that. Knowing that little bit of civics can make a world of difference, especially because when people don't have civic education, they also tend to have low political efficacy. We've talked about that in several episodes before. You have internal political efficacy, how much people think they know and how much they actually know, and external political efficacy, how much people think they can affect politics and how much they actually do. When you have low political efficacy, in either case, it tends to make you more susceptible to manipulation or even accepting of violence. You don't, for example, in the internal side, you don't know as much about politics. You might think you know way more about politics than you actually do, but you listen to all these people who you agree with because, oh, well, you know what? They know what they're doing, so I'm just going to listen to them. And sometimes those are the people who are trying to manipulate you. And if they're not outright calling for violence, they're trying to tell you that other side is being violent. And then that's makes you more accepting of violence in return. And then external political violence, when people think they can't affect government, when they think their voice isn't being heard, a lot of times they'll be more accepting of, you know what? I'm going to be violent against these institutions. I'm going to go blow up this building. I'm going to shoot people in this building. I'm going to stab people in this building. And the people who are in the government in these buildings. People start to think like that, at least more so. And also, improved civics education will make us better at recognizing misinformation and disinformation. And it's also important to recognize when which is happening too. But much of this misinformation and disinformation is meant to incite violence. It's, or at the very least, it's meant to incite rage, which a lot of times leads to violence. So, an improved civics education will do wonders in tamping down this political violence. Another way that we can all help tamp down political violence: distinctly acknowledge each other's humanity. Obviously, a lot easier said than done, especially when we're already in a heightened state of emotion. Even if we think people are jerks or terrible people, we have to recognize they are still human. Let's take Charlie Kirk and Melissa Hortman for existence. Let's say, for the sake of argument, let's just say they're both bad people. Charlie Kirk was a terrible person. Melissa Hortman was a terrible person. Just for this exercise, we'll say that that's the case. That's just them. So let's say that you do decide to be violent against them. They are still people, and they have a lot of people that care about them. They both had spouses. They both had children. They both had extended family and friends that loved them and cared a lot about them. People who didn't have anything to do with your grievance. So, even if you think you're proving a point against them and what they stand for, you're still leaving a trail of broken lives who had nothing to do with this. They might not even share the same views as the murder victims. Because let's call it what it is. These are murders. Charlie Kirk was murdered. Melissa Hortman was murdered. Josh Shapiro and Donald Trump were subject to attempted murders. You're not just affecting those specific people when you kill them, when you incite violence against them. You're affecting all these other people that had nothing to do with what you were upset about. So why is that okay? So you're not just refusing to acknowledge that the people that you supported violence against were humans, even if you think they're jerks. You're basically not acknowledging the fact that the people who cared about them, who loved them, are also human. There is a very disturbing level of dehumanization that we see in today's politics. And to some extent, we're all guilty of it. Sometimes we see somebody as one dimensional that we are pissed off at, that we're just furious at. Even if we don't actually support violence against them, we still oftentimes dehumanize them in our minds or in our speech. But that's just not, that's not how we should be going about this. Because it's going to affect a lot more people when you dehumanize them. And it just starts inciting more and more people, even if we're not intending to do that. And I want to go back to something that previous guests of mine, Guy and Heidi Burgess of the Conflict Information Consortium, talked about on this podcast a couple months ago. Two big words that can help transform our political dialogue, and that's listen and respect. You do not have to agree with people, but you do have to let them say their piece. If you're really going to treat them as human beings, you cannot just suffocate their opinion. If you really see people as equals in terms of humanity, you're not going to shut them out. You may get very angry. You may put your fingers in your ears and go, I can't hear you. But to actually try to forcibly suppress that opinion, that is treating them as less than human. And unfortunately, for all that America stood for in terms of freedom of speech, at least ideally, that is an ideal that we have not lived up to in a lot of cases. There are many cases where we were acting completely antithetical to that. Listen and respect. We're all human beings here. Even if we think that that person over there is a jerk, we're all human. Another way that we can help tamp down political violence: we cannot be apathetic and we cannot tune out of politics. Now, this is going back to episode 50 of this podcast, which talked about political apathy. Apathy lets the worst parts of politics fester and become worse. Because the more affectively polarized people who are absolutely not apathetic, in fact, they have the opposite issue of caring too much, they have an outsized influence on politics because they participate much more often than the non-polarized people, who a lot of times are more apathetic or at least inconsistent in how much they participate. But there is a lot of the reasons that people have apathy or disenchantment. They just don't want anything to do with politics, not because they don't care, but because they're frustrated and they're tired. A lot of it is understandable. And we should acknowledge those reasons people have for being apathetic or disenchanted. And not everybody has to get involved in politics, but we do need a lot more people to at least stand up and say, no, we are not having this anymore. This is not how we're going to be as a country. We need to teach people why apathy and not doing anything makes things worse. You may think politics doesn't concern you, but boy, oh boy, that could not be further from the truth. It does concern you. You don't have to eat, sleep, and breathe politics 24/7 like some of us do. I mean, I don't do it 24/7, but I do consume politics much more than I'd like to sometimes. And in fact, it's better that you don't consume it 24/7, because then you get to the opposite issue of caring too much. But you do need to be willing to actually push for real change that pushes back against polarization and violence. So that's something we really need to work on. That's one of the most difficult things, is trying to get apathetic people to not be apathetic because, well, they're apathetic. That doesn't mean that that can't change. That has changed for lots of people over the course of history, but that is something we need to make sure that we do not do. And we teach people who are apathetic, hey, look, this is not going to get any better. This does involve you. Another way we can help tamp down political violence and its acceptance is responsible social media usage. Do not angrily engage with rage bait. That is exactly what rage baiters want you to do. They want you to get angry and to tweet, comment, post angry stuff in response. And then that just lets that content circulate. We circulate content meant to make people more accepting of violence, or of at least anger, which can lead to violence, even when we're not intending to. So when you see social media content that is ignorant, insightful, not insightful as INSIGHTFUL, more INCITEFUL, it's inciting content. Take a step back, think about, what should my response be? Do I need to say something? Am I doing what the person who posted this content wants me to do, which is to get angry and respond? Every one of us can be better in this regard, because we all see things that piss us off, because we're humans. It's a very human emotion to be angry, and it's not necessarily inherently wrong to be angry, but it needs to be productive anger. Need to be angry at the willingness of people to be violent, but we also need to be careful that we don't engage all the time with content that is meant to incite violence. Another way to tamp down on political violence, and this is something that this is maybe one of the biggest issues to tackle right now. Don't only focus on one side. It's pretty obvious, even though people are wanting to just deny this. Political violence is a problem across the board. Republicans are dying for their views. Democrats are dying for their views. Independents are dying for their views. Nobody should be dying for stating their opinion. So we need to stop making excuses for bad behavior of the side we are inclined to agree with. And not just even excuses, sometimes just complete disregard. There are a lot of people on the left that are saying, boy, the right is so violent. And then there are a lot of people on the right that are saying, boy, the left is so violent, completely ignoring whenever their side does it. I mean, just 3 months ago, liberal Democrat Melissa Hortman was assassinated. And now, just last week, conservative liberal conservative Republican Charlie Kirk assassinated. Two very different political or sets of political opinions. How can we say that it's just one side being violent? Because it's not. It is very clearly a problem across the political spectrum. And just having these politicians, social media grifters, regular people say otherwise is unconscionable. Now, see, I'm getting a little frustrated here too. I need to bring it back a little. I need to make sure that I'm not going off here. But we need to stop making excuses for bad behavior of the side we're inclined to agree with, or even worse, flat out ignore that bad behavior. We cannot just be mad when one side is doing something wrong, in this case, inciting violence or accepting violence. We have to call out justifications of violence unequivocally. Yeah, but Charlie Kirk said no. Yeah, but Melissa Hortman said no. It does not matter. Even if they are jerks, we're jerks. Even if we find their views anathema, we cannot, under any circumstances, say that these murders were okay, or that they had it coming, or, oh, this was a very sad thing. But they said, no, full stop. This is not how things should be. It's murder. There's no saying, oh, they called it upon themselves. No, that's not how we should be treating this. We have to call out acts of violence unequivocally and make sure that we're calling it when it's left and right and middle, whatever. And when it's being justified, we have to call it out each time and not just overly focus on one side doing it. Even if we were going to say, well, yeah, my side is doing it too, but this side is way worse. The left is way worse about it. The right is way worse about it. That is still contributing to the problem. Because now still people think they're not being heard. They're like, we're doing it. No. You are the one who is way worse about it. And then we're still not getting anywhere. We're not actually fixing anything because we're concerned about making the other side look worse. Another way that we can tamp down political violence and its justification, we need to clearly support pluralism and democracy, not the suppression of voices or authoritarianism. Pluralism and democracy are directly antithetical to the forces that incentivize anger. And there's been a lot of talk lately about authoritarianism. Is Donald Trump an authoritarian? Is he not? That's outside of the purview of this discussion, and that's not going to help anything anyways. That's something that other people can talk about. But if we are going to stand against authoritarianism, we cannot employ the same tools that authoritarians use, like making people choose a side. That is exactly what authoritarians do. Now, there are some cases where you do have to take a stand on something. Not saying that that's not the case, but to constantly tell people that if you don't side with us, you are part of the problem. That is not helping anything. That is just going to make people more accepting of violence. Like, no, my side is correct. Yours is wrong. You know what? We have to take you out. No, that is not what we can do. That is not what we should be doing. Demonizing people who think differently than us, that's a thing authoritarians do. Taking this cult of personality or just agreeing with anything that we or the people that we tend to support and then not taking them to account for anything, that's something that authoritarians do too. They tell you that this particular person can't do anything wrong and that they shouldn't be called out, or that their apparatus that they use cannot be wrong. No. Yet they absolutely can be wrong. Anybody can be. Every single person can be. because they're human beings. We need to stop treating people as infallible. Doesn't matter if their name is Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or Greg Abbott, Ron DeSantis, JB Pritzker, Gavin Newsom. It doesn't matter. Nobody should be treated as if they can't do anything wrong. There's not a single person that we should be looking at to act as if to constantly brown nose, to constantly be sycophants to. That is going to make things worse. That is going to make people more accepting of violence. Because if they just accept everything that their chosen person does, even if that person calls out violence, they're going to say, the supporters are just going to say, yeah, well, you know what? They're always right about everything, though. No, we cannot treat people as infallible. We have to clearly support pluralism and democracy and letting people say their piece. We don't come up with the best solutions by shutting people out. That never leads to the best policy. It just doesn't, because people who dissent, even if their side is quote unquote wrong, they might still bring up reasonable opposition to a policy you have, and you can say, "Oh, you know what? I never thought about that." You don't get that with the suppression of voices and authoritarianism. You do get that with pluralism and democracy. And then lastly, one reason or one way, the last way to tamp down political violence. And of course, these are by no means all the ways that you can do it. These are just some ways that, simple ways that any of us can go about individually tamping down political violence. Recognize that calls to violence are not the norm. I know it's very easy to assume that it is, and to just see all these people that are outraged and everything, and to think that they're more numerous than they actually are. Again, it goes back to that some people think the other side is way more violent and calling for violence than they actually are. And that happens both ways, both left against right and right against left. People calling for violence is not the norm. They are just having an outsized influence and an outsized voice because of things like social media algorithms and the human proclivity for anger. There's a major exaggeration of how many people want violence in politics. And then that misperception leads to others accepting retaliatory violence. So then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We say, oh, well, you know what? They're going to be violent to us, so we have to be violent to them. We have to protect ourselves. But that just makes political violence a bigger issue. So, all that to say, progress starts with all of us. We cannot completely erase violence and polarization, but we can mitigate a lot of it. And there are improper ways to move forward that will make things worse, even if we think we are making things better. So it goes back to that whole self-awareness aspect. We have to make sure that we are really moving in the right direction. We have to be self-critical, not just critical of other people. We have to be critical of ourselves. And one of those things to think about, attacking critics of the victims who aren't happy about the murder of these victims, but they still disagree with the victims' policies. We need to be careful about how we address that. We cannot use the fact that they disagreed with these victims' politics as an excuse to silence these dissenters. Now, at the same time, using those victims' politics as a justification for murder needs to be condemned. So, people going to say, well, you know, Charlie Kirk said such and such. Well, you know, Melissa Hortman said such and such. No, that is not okay. But at the same time, we should not just because somebody disagreed with their politics at some point, We should not be using that to silence their views or kick them out of office or make them lose their jobs, because that is a complete overreaction, and also just an excuse to seize the moment for yourself and for your side by saying, oh, if they weren't so critical of the victims, these victims wouldn't have died, or some sort of ridiculous justification like that. If the critics of the victims are in some way justifying the murder, that is something that needs to be condemned and needs to be forcefully condemned. But victims or critics of the victims who aren't happy about their murder and are not going, yeah, but, and saying, well, they had it coming or something like that, but they were critics of these victims in the past, we cannot be silencing them either. That is just going to make things worse. And then those people being silenced, they may start to suddenly decide, well, you know what? The only way I can be heard is if we start to make ourselves be heard with physical force. And again, need to emphasize this, cannot emphasize this enough. This is not a one-sided thing. This is clearly not a one-sided thing because people across the board are being killed for their beliefs. So only attacking one side's violence is absurdly biased and then just makes others angrily retaliate. No, you are the one who is violent. Stop focusing only on one side's reaction to the murders. When people on the right treat Charlie Kirk's murder as much more heinous, or people on the left treat Melissa Hortman's murder as much more heinous, that is also a problem. Make no mistake, Charlie Kirk and Melissa Hortman's murders are both horrific, and one is not more important than the other. And we shouldn't be treating anybody's murder for their views as more important when we agree with their views. That is a horrible way to go about things. That is a very inhumane way to go about things. So be willing to call out your side as well. Be willing to forcefully condemn when left and right and middle do it. Now, what about if we think other people are calling for violence? You have to be really careful with that. We cannot treat words as violence unless they are deliberately calling for attacking other people. Because there is this notion, and again, it goes back to some of these reasons that people justify violence in their heads, of these moralized attitudes or treating politics as an existential crisis, where we see somebody's words, and because they think differently than us, we think they're being violent. That is in itself a rather violent way to think. So we need to make sure that other people are clearly calling for violence. And that's actually pretty easy to tell if we're not letting our bias think for us. You're saying, yeah, good, Charlie Kirk had it coming. Yeah, good, Melissa Hortman had it coming. Josh Shapiro and Donald Trump, they should have gotten what was coming to them. That is words as violence. And that needs to be condemned. But when you're just saying, when you are giving the proper notice of these murders as being as horrific as they are, but you in the past were critics of Charlie Kirk or Melissa Hortman's views, that is not violence. Because you weren't actually calling for violence. You were saying, I did not like their policies or their views. So we cannot treat words as violence unless they are actually calling for violence. Because to do otherwise is very problematic, and that leads to these issues of suppressing other people's voices, which leads to more violence. And already touched on it before, but needs to be stressed again. The apathetic and disenchanted need to get more involved. which is obviously a lot easier said than done. And those feelings are very understandable to some extent, but we need them to get involved. Otherwise, the polarized voices that are calling for violence and or only focusing on one side being violent, they're going to win. And then we're not going to fix our broken political discourse. And also, stop worrying so much about winning. We are so wrapped up in whether we're winning in terms of, oh, my policies, they have to be the ones that win the day. That's not all that it's about. And sometimes you're not right. Or it's still an opinion, but and there's no objective right or wrong, but you don't have everything figured out. None of us do. But we need to stop acting like we do. So this whole thing about, oh, we need to win at all costs. Okay, if you win your policy now, but what happens when the other side wins? And based on how you treated them, they retaliate against you and just completely erase everything you did and suppress your voice when you try to suppress their voice. And then it's just going to keep going back and forth, back and forth. It's this vicious pendulum that just keeps swinging. Yes, obviously, when we're fighting for something we believe in, we're going to want to win. But it should not come to the point where we think that our existence is threatened because we lost. We should not be getting to the point where winning's the only thing. This isn't sports. And even then, in sports, we get so wrapped up in winning. Sometimes you're not going to win, and that's how it is. You don't always have to win. And even if you do win, what cost are you winning at? If you're deteriorating politics further or you're inciting violence, even though you won, is that really actually helping anything? No. If anything, any one thing can be taken away from this podcast episode, it's that political violence meant to silence opposing views is under no circumstances an acceptable course of action. Now, unfortunately, political violence as a whole is not entirely avoidable, not with how human nature is. But the problem is we treat it as unavoidable even when we can stop it. This does not have to be the norm. We do not have to just accept that people are going to die just because they profess what they believe. Certainly not in this country. And in a lot of other countries, it's expected. It cannot be the case here. And obviously, it'd be nice if no country did it. But we cannot be accepting of silencing views through violence, through death, because we did not like the views of that other person, or we just didn't like that person, period. We just can't have that. That is not what America is about. And that's not what we should be about. But to leave this on an even more positive note, I know there's a lot of this was negative. Positives are that we can do something about this. We can make things better. But I want to end on an especially positive note. There are a lot of groups that are pushing back against violence and its acceptance that you can look into. You don't necessarily need to start getting fully involved in these groups, but you can, and even if you don't donate to these groups, you can still promote their work and show people, hey, there is a better way to go about politics. There's a webinar I just went to this last Sunday that was called Dignity Over Violence. It was hosted by Braver Angels. So September 13th, it just happened. That brought together a lot of individuals and representatives of groups that are trying to build bridges, that are trying to mitigate polarization. I'm going to leave you with more than a handful, but these are by far, or by not by any means, the only groups that are involved in this. I want to make sure I make that clear. But just some of the examples of groups that are trying to make politics work better, that are trying to make political discourse better. Braver Angels, Listen First Project, Beyond Intractability, Constructive Dialogue Institute, One America Movement, National Civic League, National Institute for Civil Discourse, Living Room Conversations, More Perfect Union, Bridge USA, American Pluralist Alliance, Civic Health Project. All of these groups can use your help, even if you simply just promote their work. I'm going to do everything I can to try to help their work as well, and doing my own thing. And you can help all that too. You can show people, hey, this is not what politics has to be. We can come together and forge a better path forward. So just want to leave you with that. We can make things better. This is something that we can't sugarcoat, but at the same time, I hope you're leaving it with a more optimistic view of what American can be. And I know it's very difficult. Admittedly, I have trouble with it too. Sometimes I think about all this stuff that I'm doing here, and I think about, is this even worth it? Is anybody even listening? And sometimes you just got to keep going. And this is not just saying it for you. Sometimes I have to tell myself this too. So I really want to make sure that people realize that, and that all of us can do small, simple things to make things better. So that's going to do it for today's episode of the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. This podcast is on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Links in the show notes, my Facebook page, Paul Rader, author and speaker, LinkedIn profile, my 5-day educational email course that doesn't talk specifically about violence, but it talks about political polarization, which feeds into political violence, and some of the mistakes we make that can accidentally inflame polarization and make it worse, why we make those mistakes, and how we can correct those mistakes. The my medium.com profile, my book on Amazon, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections, and how they could become more competitive. That's not arguing for or against independence, just talking about ways that they can improve their fortunes. So you don't have to be a Republican or Democrat or independent to read the book. It's something that everybody can get something out of. And my website, paulrader.org. So going to wrap it up here with that. And once again, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.